location of Washington, D.C. is both a blessing and a curse. Lying between the North and the South, this coastal city on the Chesapeake Bay is easily accessible by water and by land. Such a location and the lack of natural barriers facilitates visits by foes as well as by friends. In this last segment, we will visit the nearby battlefield sites, each identified with a time of peril for the nation in general and for the capital in particular. The British attack by sea on Fort Mchenry in nearby Baltimore during the War of 1812, and the two Confederate land battles at Manassas, Virginia during the Civil War posed grave threats to our nation's capital, only 40 miles away. We begin with Fort Mchenry, site of an important victory and origin of our national anthem. I'm here at Baltimore Bay Harbor at Fort Mchenry, the site of the historic battle during the War of 1812 that saved Baltimore from capture, and also the national shrine, because a poem based on that battle of Baltimore became our national anthem. The Battle of Baltimore was one of the few successes in the War of 1812, and for a while in 1814 things were going very badly as the British prepared a major offensive on three fronts. Their plan was to invade from the north, from Canada and into New York, as well as capture New Orleans, and finally, or the third phase, is to come into the Chesapeake Bay. The first phase did not work when the British were stopped at Plattsburgh. The later attack on New Orleans would also fail. But here, their efforts at Chesapeake Bay proved initially successful, as the British easily defeated the armies at Washington, D.C., occupied and burned our national capital. The British left Washington and went up the river to begin their attack on Baltimore. The bombardment from the British fleet started on September 13th, 1814, and continued into the next day. During the 25-hour bombardment, more than 1,800 shells were fired from the British ships upon this fort. It was from this fort, though, that Francis Scott Key was observing in the harbor and wrote the poem that became our national anthem. The flag at the time had 15 stars and 15 stripes, representing the number of states in the Union in 1814. And it was this flag that would inspire our national anthem. America is the only nation on the planet Earth that has a national anthem that asks a question. And the question is, did the flag that was seen flying on September 13th, was it still at dawn flying on the 14th? That is the question. And it was Key that in a ship in the harbor that watched this bombardment, that saw, in a sense, the bombs bursting in air and the rockets' red glare as the British attempted to capture this fort. After the battle, the commanding general, George Armistead, was given the flag, and it was kept in his family for generations until it was turned over to the United States government in 1907. Today, the original flag is on display at Smithsonian Institution for all Americans to see, that flag that was seen by Francis Scott Key, and that flag that was flying when the British fleet at 7 a.m. halted their bombardment and left the harbor. as the American soldiers played Yankee Doodle Dandy and threw up their hats in celebration. Being here at Fort Mchenry, one can well imagine what it was like for Francis Scott Key, who was on a boat and watched the 25-hour bombardment. Being here gives resonance to his words that talked about the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air as part of the British fleet attack on this fort. And there was Francis Scott Key waiting, asking if the flag would still fly after that bombardment. In terms of our national anthem, it not only opens with the question, but it closes also with the question. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner still wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. The intense bombardment of Fort Mchenry, beginning on September 13, 1814, was the most intense bombardment on American soil at any time in the nation's history. The shells that were lobbed that referred to the bombs bursting in the air, it would be a shell like this, a hollow shell that was filled with flammable liquid. If Fort Mchenry had fallen and the British ships were allowed to bombard Baltimore, it was estimated that most of the city would have burned because of these incendiary bombs would have burned the many wooden frame houses. I'm in Fort Mchenry in what they call is a bomb-proof, which is the equivalent of a bomb shelter to provide protection during bombardment. Fortunately, after 1814, Baltimore was never again under attack. Unfortunately for the 1,000 soldiers that were here on September of 1814, these bomb-proofs were not built. They were only built after the initial battle, but luckily never used. We are here in the headquarters of General George Armistead, who commanded Fort Mchenry during the bombardment. Armistead had taken command of this post in June of 1813, and one of his first orders was to design and have constructed the enormous flag. The reason he had the flag made was, as he wrote, "It is my desire to have a flag so large that the British fleet will have little difficulty in seeing it from a distance." This act of defiance would lay the framework for our national anthem. These are the cannon at Fort Mchenry that contributed to the American success that night on September 13th. These cannon fired cannonballs of either 12 or 36 pounds. And the cannonballs were referred to as hot shots because they posed a particularly danger to the wooden ships of the British fleet. As a result, the British fleet kept its distance from the fort, and many of the rockets and bombs used by the British on this fort fell short of their target or missed it. We are at Manassas, Virginia, where on a warm day in July 1861, two armies of a divided nation clashed in the first major ground battle of the Civil War, a conflict which had started 3 months earlier. The Union forces under General McDowell were marching from Washington and on their way to Richmond when they confronted a Confederate force of 30,000 here at Manassas Junction, an important railroad junction along the Bull Run River. I'm standing in front of the Henry home on the Henry Hilltop, a place that saw much of the intense fighting during the first battle of Bull Run. The only occupant that day in the home was the 85-year-old Judith Henry, a widow who was living alone in the house at the time. In the late afternoon, she died by an explosion of an artillery shell aimed at the house where Confederate sharpshooters were on the second floor. Her death provides an interesting bookend to her life. For Judith Henry was born in the 1770s when our nation was being born, and she died in the 1860s when our nation was being divided. The 10-hour battle had two phases. The first phase, the morning session, began at 5:30 a.m. when Union troops began an artillery barrage on the Confederate forces. During the morning, the Union forces took charge, and their victory appeared at one point possible when the Confederates retreated up Henry Hill in disorder. However, the Confederates were able to rally, in part because of the example set by General Thomas Jackson. By noon, there would be a lull for an hour. This is a spot where General Thomas Jackson earned his nickname Stonewall. In the late morning, when the Confederates were in retreat, Jackson's brigade stood firm. As a result, another Confederate general trying to rally his troops pointed over to the Jackson brigade and said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." The Confederate forces were able to rally at that time and prevent a Union victory. The afternoon session began at 1 p.m. after an hour lull in which both sides regrouped. For the next 3 hours, there was intense fighting on this field as 50,000 soldiers engaged in combat. During the entire time, victory appeared uncertain for either side, but the tide of the battle was turned at 4 p.m. when Confederate reinforcements arrived and broke through the Union's right flank, delivering, in a sense, the Confederates their first victory. The story of the first Battle of Bull Run is not just the Confederate victory, but also the Union rout. What had started out as an organized retreat back to Washington became a rout when panic spread among the Union forces along the roads jammed with spectators who had come to observe what they thought would be an easy victory. Although the Union forces left in a rout, the Confederate forces here were too disorganized in order to mount a successful attack in the North. At the end of the day, there were more than just 900 soldiers left dead on this field. Also left shattered was the hope of an early and certain Union victory. I'm standing in front of the bridge that went across Bull Run Creek. It was on this bridge that retreating Union soldiers had to pass on the way back through the North. The fact that this was one of the only few bridges across the creek contributed to the panic that turned the retreat of Union soldiers after the first Battle of Bull Run into a rout. If you notice, this battle has two names. The Battle of Bull Run, named after the creek, or the Battle of Manassas, named after the town 5 miles away. When we look at Civil War history, we see this pattern. The Confederates often named their battles after towns, such as Sharpsburg in Maryland or Manassas here in Virginia, while the Union named the battles after a significant geographic feature, such as Antietam Creek in Maryland, or here, Bull Run Creek in Virginia. At the First Battle of Bull Run, as in most of the battles in the Civil War, the Union side enjoyed a superiority in numbers as well as in technology. However, when we look at this battle, or the logistics of this battle, we find that they often were not able to take advantage of such superiority. The example of it is here on the battlefield. The Union had better cannon, rifle barrel, that could fire a larger charge at a larger distance. The Confederates had a smoothbore cannon that was not as effective. But when the artillery faced each other on this battlefield, we discovered that the Union cannons often overshot their targets, while the Confederate cannons were able to effectively hit Union targets. The 10 hours of heavy fighting in the First Battle of Bull Run left dead 900 soldiers and left shattered the hopes that this war would be short and the Union victory would be certain. 13 months after the First Battle of Bull Run, Union and Confederate forces would again clash at Manassas, Virginia. This time, the battle would last 3 days and result in more than 3,000 soldiers being killed. What we saw at the second battle was basically a repeat of the first. The Union forces, this time under General Pope, marching south toward Richmond and being stopped by the Confederate forces outside Manassas. The highlight of the 3-day battle was when General Longstreet made a counterattack on the Union forces that had for 2 days charged against the Confederate troops. Longstreet's counterattack swept the Union Army off the field, and their forces had to retreat more than 3 miles. General Pope commanded a larger force than that of Lee, but during the 3-day battle, Lee took many bold actions and Pope made many mistakes. The end of the battle occurred on the third day, when General Longstreet launched a massive counterattack that swept away the Union forces. Only a heroic stand here on Henry Hill prevented a Union debacle. The stand here on the hill allowed the Union Army to retreat rather than be annihilated. Lee's decisive win here prompted his first invasion of the North, as he sought international help for the Confederate cause and an end to the Civil War. I'm standing at the junction of Lee Highway and the Manassas-Sudley Road. In back of me is the Stone House, the best preserved landmark on this battlefield. This house was in the center of the fighting during the Second Battle of the Manassas, and actually at one point it served as a hospital for Union soldiers and then a hospital for the Confederate wounded. As we end this part 4 of American Heart, we end our visits to the historic sites across our nation. Our journey started in Jamestown with the theme of colonization. We then explored Revolution, visiting Williamsburg and Boston. We continued our venture by first visiting the battlefields of the American Civil War and American tragedy, and then exploring the sites of industrialization and immigration, testimonials to Americans' triumphs. We conclude our journey in the Capitol, seat of American power, and the site of many American monuments to our rich history. I'm Dr. Robert Rupp. Thank you for joining me as we walk through the footsteps of history.